Part 8. Yaakov returns. Today, we're actually starting in chapter 32, when Yaakov was crossing the border back into the territory that El Shaddai had promised to Avraham and Yitzhak before him. At the end of last week's parashah, Lavan and Yaakov parted company for the last time, having made a covenant between themselves that each would stay in his own territory, with Lavan saying, "May God, the God of Avraham and also the God of Nahor, the God of their fathers, judge between us." But Yaakov swore by the one his father Yitzhak feared, who was El Shaddai. Yaakov offered a sacrifice on the mountain and invited his kinsmen to the meal. They ate the food and spent the whole night on the mountain. Early in the morning, Lavan got up, kissed his sons and daughters, and blessed them. Then Lavan left and went and returned to his own place. Yaakov went in his way, and the angels of God met him. If we reflect back 20 years to the morning after his dream of the ladder which had its head reaching up into the heaven, El Shaddai blessed Yaakov with the words in chapter 28 verse 15, "Look, I am with you, I will guard you wherever you go, and I will bring you back into this land." Now on his return journey, he was seeing many of God's angels coming towards him. So Yaakov, seeing El Shaddai, was fulfilling his earlier promise. Yaakov was about to re-enter the land, which we now know, of course, as Eretz-Yisra'el. Because when Yaakov was about to leave the promised territory, El Shaddai sent his angels to Yaakov, who cared for him over the 20 years that he was in Haran. Now he was about to cross back over the Yabok into the promised territory, so the angels who had protected Yaakov outside of the territory were now departing, and the angels who would protect him in Eretz-Yisra'el were coming forth from the presence of El Shaddai. Even though Yaakov was being protected by the angels approaching him, he still held internal fears about meeting with his twin brother Esav. Even then, after 20 years, Yaakov wondered if his brother may still want to kill him. So he sent out messengers ahead of him towards Seir, the country of Edom. Yaakov's servants returned with a message that greatly increased the fear of Yaakov, because they said, "We went to your brother Esav, and he is coming to meet you, and with him are 400 men. Finally, Yaakov comes to his senses and says, "O God of my father Avraham, God of my father Yitzhak, El Shaddai, please rescue me from my brother Esav. I'm afraid of him, afraid he will come and attack me without regard for mothers or children." Even then, instead of trusting that El Shaddai was going to follow through with his promise, Yaakov still took the matter into his own hands by preparing 3 large gifts to present to Esav, with the hope that he would calm down and be accepting of Yaakov. Then, having divided the gifts into 3 separate groups, with servants leading each group, he sent them off over the river towards the approaching army of Esav. He gave those instructions to each of the 3 gift leaders and sent them on their way southward across the Yabok River. Each leader was to give Esav the same message: "Just behind me, your servant Yaakov, and maybe he will be friendly toward me." This appears to be the origin of the old Nordic children's story about the 3 billy goats gruff, which is known to children throughout the Western world. So returning back to verse 22, the gift crossed over ahead of him, and he himself stayed the night in the camp. But before he settled down for the night, he decided also to send his 2 wives and 2 slave girls and their children and all the possessions across the Yabok River. Then he remained alone for that night. During the night, a man appeared from out of the darkness and began wrestling with Yaakov until daybreak. Finally, the man saw that he could not overpower Yaakov. So he struck Yaakov on the hip, saying in verse 27, "Let me go, because it is daybreak." But Yaakov replied, "I won't let you go unless you bless me." The exchange between them became even more interesting when the man says in verse 28, "What is your name?" He answered, "Yaakov." And then the man said, "From now on you will no longer be called Yaakov, but Israel, because you have shown your strength to both God and men and have prevailed." It is interesting that in the verses it says, "You will no longer be called Yaakov, but Israel." Because the reality is that there are many examples in the Tanakh where both Yaakov and Israel are spoken about in the same verse. The first example where both names appear is in Shemot, Exodus chapter 19 verse 3, when Yahweh instructs Moshe to prepare the people to meet Yahweh, when he says, "Here is what you are to say to the household of Yaakov and to tell the people of Israel." So when we look closely at the words of Bereshit 32 verse 28, it appears to be saying that rather than replacing his name of Yaakov with Israel, he is actually receiving what we call today a surname, which will later be applied to the nation that will comprise his own natural descendants, along with others who will be adopted into one of the 12 tribes. All will bear the surname of Israel. 3 further examples can be found in Bamidbar, Numbers chapter 23, where first in verse 7, Balak wants Balaam to curse the people by saying, "Come, curse Yaakov for me, and come, denounce Israel." Then in verse 10, "Who has counted the dust of Yaakov, or numbered the ashes of Israel?" And finally in verse 21, "No one has seen the guilt of Yaakov, or perceived the perversity in Israel." Finally, in the days of Isaiah, when the king of Ashur settled people into the cities of Shomron, they failed to observe the mitzvah of Torah. So Yahweh said in 2 Kings 17:34, "To this day they continue to follow their former pagan customs. They do not fear Yahweh. They do not follow the regulations and rulings of Torah, or the mitzvot which Yahweh has ordered the descendants of Yaakov, whom he has called by the name of Israel." The same pattern is prevalent in many other places in the Tanakh, where the words often match or are similar to Isaiah 48 verse 1, where Yahweh Zevaot says, "Listen to this, house of Yaakov, called by the name of Israel." That very clearly suggests that Israel is being used as a surname. So moving on, before the mystery man disappears, Yaakov said, "Please tell me your name." But he answered, "Why do you ask about my name?" The man who wrestled with Yaakov does not reveal his identity at any stage in that encounter, but we know it was El Shaddai manifesting as a human in human form by the words that Yaakov said in verse 31, "I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been spared." So Yaakov called the place Penei El, face of God. Next, the narrative turns to Yaakov's coming face to face with Esav, where he falls prostrate on the ground 7 times before approaching his brother. In chapter 33 verses 4 and 5, Esav ran to meet him, hugged him, threw his arms around his neck and kissed him, and they wept. Esav looked up, and on seeing the women and children, he asked, "Whose are these?" Yaakov answered, "The children God has graciously given to your servant." Then Yaakov presented his gift in three stages before Esav. But Esav responded by declining the gifts and claiming he had more than enough. However, Yaakov persisted with his offer, insisting that Esav take the gifts. As it says in verse 11, God has dealt kindly with me, and I have enough. Thus he urged him until he finally accepted. Esav then decided it was time to move on. So Yaakov suggested Esav go ahead, and he would follow more slowly to avoid overworking the flocks, herds, and the children. So Esav, having offered to leave an escort behind him to guide Yaakov on his way, but Yaakov declined the offer of the escort because he had no intention of following. Yet again, Yaakov was being deceptive in saying that he was going to follow slowly because he had no intention of going and following Esav to Seir. Instead, Yaakov waited until Esav departed, and he turned and marched slowly in the opposite direction towards Shechem in the north. Upon arrival in Shechem, Yaakov purchased a parcel of land from Hamor, where Yaakov pitched his tent, preparing to stay for a considerable time. He also built an altar to El Shaddai and named it Eretz-Yisra'el, God, the God of Israel. That brings us to the end, chapter 33. Moving on into chapter 34, having settled in Shechem, Dinah, Yaakov's only daughter, became friendly with the local girls. But one day, the son of Hamor grabbed her, raped her, and humiliated her, claiming he loved her. He spoke to his father about buying Dinah because he wanted her as his wife. In response, Hamor approached Yaakov to make an offer for his daughter. But Yaakov, when he heard what had happened, he withheld from accepting the offer. Instead of negotiating a bride price, he waited until his sons returned from tending the flocks. They persuaded their father not to enter into any marriage relationship for Dinah. Hamor, realizing that his proposal had failed, embarked on the idea that the two communities could intermarry by exchanging the sons of Hevi for the daughters of Yaakov, and vice versa. This was yet another intervention by the adversary to blend the future national life of Israel to the local descendants of the Canaanite, whom El Shaddai had already stated would be removed completely when Yaakov's descendants returned to take possession of the territory. Behind the back of their father, in verses 13 to 16, Yaakov's sons devised an equally devious scheme by laying down terms for the marriage of their sister. So they required all the males of Shechem to be circumcised before any intermarriage, because they would then become rightful heirs to the promised territory and would become part of the future of Israel. Therefore, Yaakov's sons put an ultimatum to Hamor and Shechem, saying, "If you become circumcised, we will give Dinah as a bride, but if you don't, we'll take her away." But they had no intention of following through with the plan that was presented. The challenge was accepted by every male in Shechem, and they were duly circumcised. But on the third day, when the pain was greatest, Shimon and Levi went through the city, slaughtered all the circumcised males. They also plundered the city and took livestock and looted the houses. In a strange way, El Shaddai had once again prevented the adversary's ploy to intermix with previously condemned Hivi people by preventing them from becoming intermarried with Yaakov's family. Such was the massacre in Shechem that Yaakov and his whole family had to move away before the neighboring people groups came after them in reprisal. El Shaddai spoke to Yaakov yet again and said, "Go to Beit El, where he had originally had the dream 20 years earlier, and live there." El Shaddai also warned Yaakov to get rid of the foreign gods that were in their possession. El Shaddai brought a spirit of terror on all the surrounding cities so that none of the neighbors pursued Yaakov and his family. They gave Yaakov all the foreign gods in their possession and the earrings that they were wearing, and Yaakov buried them under the pistachio tree in Shechem. When the sons of Yaakov, having plundered the city of Shechem, they took with them the people's foreign gods and personal jewelry, which El Shaddai was well aware of and wanted removed from the camp of Yaakov. It was quite possible that in the midst of all that burial of the false gods, that Rachel gave up her foreign gods that she had stolen from her father's house in Haran. So upon arriving in Beit El, Yaakov built yet another altar, and again calls upon El Shaddai, naming the place El Beit El. Then Yaakov remembered once again his encounter with El Shaddai had happened at that very place 20 years earlier. While in Beit El, Deborah, who had been the wet nurse of Rivkah, died. So they buried her under the oak tree at Beit El. This is a strange insert into the midst of the narrative, because it does not relate to any of the circumstances surrounding the family in Beit El. The insert about Deborah almost implies that Rivkah may well have also been reunited with Yaakov at Beit El, meaning that she was still alive when Yaakov returned from Haran. Then in chapter 35, verse 29, we find that Esav and Yaakov together buried Yitzhak, their father, but there is no mention of the death or burial of Rivkah. So returning to the main focus of the narrative, we see in verses 9 through 15 that El Shaddai again speaks to Yaakov and repeats the earlier blessings that he had given to Yaakov at the beginning of his long journey, because the verses repeat Yaakov's name change, the command to be fruitful and multiply, which he'd already done, and he would become a great group of nations, and confirmation of the land promised to his father and grandfather. El Shaddai was also giving to Yaakov. Then finally, in verses 14 and 15, we are reminded yet again that 20 years earlier, Yaakov had set up and anointed a standing stone in the same place at Beit El. So having repeated much of what had been said 20 years earlier, we see that Yaakov and his family set out yet again on a journey southward, this time towards Hebron. Then, as verse 27 says, Yaakov came home to his father Yitzhak at Mamre. That's near Hebron. It appears Yaakov remained in Hebron until he was forced down into Egypt because of the famine. And we'll see more of that in chapter 46. There is one important comment that needs further consideration. That is written in verses 19 and 20, where it says that Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrat, that is Bethlehem. Yaakov set up a standing stone on her grave, which is still there to this day. The important point to consider is the actual place of the burial is not stated. It only says on the way to Ephrat. No suggestion as to where it was. However, we have one clue from much later, when we find that Samuel, the prophet, lived in Ramah, which was located on the northern boundary of Benjamin's territory. It was the place where he anointed Shaul to be the first king. Samuel says in 1 Samuel chapter 10 verse 2, "After you leave me today, you will find 2 men by Rachel's tomb in the territory of Benjamin." That verse clearly suggests that Rachel's tomb was in Samuel's hometown of Ramah. But there has been much debate between rabbinical Jews, Christians, and Muslims about the actual location of where she was buried, because her tomb is currently located at the northern entrance to the modern city of Bethlehem. So where is Ramah? It is located on the road between Beit El and Bethlehem, about 8 kilometers south of Beit El, and approximately 18 kilometers north of Bethlehem. So that is why there has been so much debate about where Rachel was actually buried. However, there is another direct link in the Gospel of Matthew, where in chapter 2 verse 18 it says, "A voice was heard in Ramah, sobbing and lamenting loudly. It was Rachel sobbing for her children and refusing to be comforted, because they are no longer alive." From those two verses, two important questions arise. Why was the voice of Rachel heard in Ramah? And why was she weeping and lamenting? Firstly, Ramah is the most likely and true location of Rachel's tomb. Secondly, the weeping and lament was because Herod the Great, having been tricked by the Magi who came to visit Yeshua shortly after his birth, departed without telling him where the baby was located. Hence Herod went on a rampage and killed all the boy babies under 2 years old in and around Bethlehem. So the reason Rachel was weeping for her lost children was because her descendants through Yaakov had been killed by Herod, who was an Edomite descended from Esav. So we see here the same old hatred arising at the time of Yeshua's birth. It was certainly no coincidence. Even though she had been dead many centuries, it was her spirit that was crying out on behalf of the children lost to the hands of Herod the Edomite. It makes sense that her voice would be heard from the place where she had been buried, which of course the Gospel says was Ramah. We must ask, why did Yaakov's beloved wife, for whom he had slaved 7 years to obtain the bride, died before he did? After all, Yaakov lived on for another 68 years. The answer falls at the feet of Yaakov himself, who made a drastic mistake when Lavan, Rachel's father, complained that someone had stolen the household gods, because he was unaware that Rachel had stolen her father's idols. As he said in 31 verse 32, "If you find your gods with someone in my family, that person will not remain alive." Even when Yaakov buried all the booty before leaving Shechem, Rachel made no mention of the family gods. In fact, they are never mentioned again. But Yaakov made this statement in the presence of El Shaddai. Hence, it was an oath that had to stand. Chapter 36 draws to a close in verses 23 to 26 with the name of the 12 sons with their respective mothers listed in order of their birth. However, the list includes Benjamin as being born in Padan Aram, which is outside the territory of promise. The inclusion of Benjamin's name may well have been a scribal mistake that was never picked up in the final canonization of Tanakh. Moving on, the whole of chapter 36 is devoted to the genealogy of Esav, that is Edom, and how having married and produced children from the Canaanite wives, he himself ruled himself out of God's plan for the development of the people group that would eternally inherit the land that is now known as Eretz-Yisra'el. Only one individual really stands out among the descendants of Esav, who impacted directly upon Yaakov's descendants. That is Amalek, who attacked Israel as they were travelling towards Mount Horeb. So while Israel travelled around the head of the Gulf of Aqaba on their way to Mount Horeb, They passed through the territory of Amalek, which we will consider in more detail when we get to Shemot chapter 17. So in conclusion, we have been on a very complex journey through this parasha with many different twists and turns. But all the matters considered have importance because together they lay a very solid foundation for what will transpire for Israel when they become a nation at Mount Horeb. It also exposes many of the reasons why the world is now turning collectively and strongly against Israel and is using the so-called Palestinians as a weapon to divide Israel on a political level, when we know, of course, that the real battle is still raging between Yeshua and the adversary for ultimate supremacy over the land of promise. However, as we know from Scripture, and more particularly from Revelation, it is only a matter of a short time before the dragon of old, Satan himself, will be chained, and Yeshua will rule and reign for 1,000 years. So until next time, Shabbat Shalom.